What if America won the Vietnam War? But instead of a triumph, the world became something no one could recognize. Hanoi falls, communism is crushed in Southeast Asia, and Washington declares victory. But soon after, the costs of that win ripple across the globe. Economic chaos, political instability, and a moral burden that shatters America's image forever. What if winning wasn't the victory the world thought it would be? This isn't the story of a war. It's the story of what came after. Chapter 1. The immediate consequences of winning victory in Vietnam wouldn't have been the end of the conflict. After defeating North Vietnam, America would face the daunting task of rebuilding a deeply divided country. South Vietnam's government was plagued by corruption and weak leadership. With the war over, the U.S. would need to maintain a military presence to prop up its ally and prevent the remnants of the Viet Cong from regaining power. The cost of this occupation would be staggering. Billions more dollars would flow into maintaining stability, as guerrilla resistance wouldn't simply vanish. Civilians in Vietnam, who had already endured years of conflict, would continue to suffer under a fragile regime propped up by foreign forces. Protests and uprisings would become an everyday reality in the countryside. Meanwhile, the geopolitical stakes would rise. The Soviet Union and China had heavily invested in North Vietnam, and their defeat wouldn't go unnoticed. Losing Vietnam would be a humiliating blow to communism, forcing both nations to rethink their strategies in the Cold War. But would they back down or retaliate elsewhere, like in Africa, the Middle East, or even Europe? For the Vietnamese people, peace would remain elusive. For America, this victory would mark the start of a new, costly chapter in the region. Chapter 2. The domestic impact of victory. Back home, the news of victory would spark nationwide celebrations. Soldiers would return to parades instead of protests, and the government would declare the Vietnam War a defining moment of American strength. But beneath the surface, the cracks would remain. The Vietnam War wasn't just about military success. It was a deeply polarizing conflict that divided Americans. Even with victory, those divisions wouldn't disappear. The anti-war movement might lose steam temporarily, but the underlying mistrust in government and military leadership would linger. Economically, the U.S. would feel the burden of a prolonged war and occupation. Billions of dollars spent on Vietnam meant less money for domestic programs, further straining the economy. Could the country afford to keep pouring resources into Southeast Asia while addressing issues like poverty, racial inequality, and infrastructure at home? And then there's the draft. Thousands of young men had been sent to Vietnam, many against their will. Even after victory, families who lost loved ones would question if the cost of war was truly worth it. While the public might celebrate in the short term, the scars left by the war wouldn't heal quickly. Chapter 3. The political and cultural legacy. In this alternate reality, the Vietnam War wouldn't be remembered as a quagmire or a failure. Instead, it would be framed as a heroic struggle against communism. Textbooks, movies, and political speeches would glorify the war as a turning point in American history. Veterans would be celebrated, their sacrifices acknowledged as key to preserving global democracy. But this narrative would come with its own set of challenges. Winning the war didn't erase the controversial tactics used to achieve victory. The widespread use of Agent Orange, napalm, and carpet bombing left entire regions of Vietnam devastated. Even in victory, the moral questions about these actions would remain. Globally, America's success would solidify its position as the dominant superpower of the Cold War. Allies would feel reassured, while rivals like the Soviet Union and China would double down on their efforts to compete. Could this lead to an escalation in other parts of the world, like a more aggressive Soviet push into the Middle East or Africa? At home, the cultural impact would be profound. A victorious Vietnam War would strengthen the idea of American exceptionalism, the belief that the U.S. has a duty to spread its values worldwide. But would this overconfidence lead to more conflicts in the future? Chapter 4. Global ramifications. Winning Vietnam would shift the Cold War in America's favor. Countries across Asia, Africa, and Latin America would see this as proof of U.S. dominance. Many nations might align with Washington out of fear of being on the losing side of history. But for the Soviet Union and China, this defeat would be a wake-up call. Losing Vietnam wouldn't just be a symbolic loss. It would weaken their credibility as champions of global communism. This could lead to a more aggressive stance elsewhere, as they try to regain influence in other regions. In Southeast Asia, America's victory would stabilize some areas but destabilize others. Neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos, which historically suffered due to U.S. intervention, might avoid complete collapse. However, prolonged U.S. involvement in the region could lead to widespread resentment and anti-American sentiment. For Vietnam itself, the scars of war would take decades to heal. Entire villages were destroyed, millions of people displaced, and the environment damaged beyond recognition. Even under American-backed rule, rebuilding the country would be an uphill battle. Chapter 5. The Dark Side of Victory. Every war has its dark side, and Vietnam would be no exception. A U.S. victory wouldn't erase the immense human cost of the conflict. For the Vietnamese people, winning might look more like exchanging one form of oppression for another. The South Vietnamese government, heavily reliant on American support, struggled with corruption and inefficiency. Would their rule bring freedom, or just another layer of control? The guerrilla warfare tactics that defined the Vietnam War wouldn't stop overnight. Insurgent groups would likely continue their fight, turning victory into a long-term occupation for America. The longer the U.S. stayed, the more it risked alienating the local population. For American soldiers, the psychological toll of the war would remain. Victory wouldn't erase the trauma of what they witnessed or the moral questions they faced. The use of chemical weapons, the destruction of civilian villages, these actions left a stain on America's conscience that victory couldn't wash away. Chapter 6. The Psychological and Moral Costs. Even in victory, the Vietnam War would leave a deep psychological and moral scar on America. For soldiers, the horrors of combat wouldn't fade with a parade or a medal. PTSD, survivor's guilt, and the memories of atrocities committed on both sides would linger for decades. For the American public, questions about the war's morality would persist. Was it worth the lives lost, the money spent, and the damage done? The use of controversial tactics like Agent Orange and napalm would spark debates that couldn't be silenced by victory speeches. The war would also challenge America's image as a defender of freedom and democracy. Could a country claim to stand for justice while using such devastating methods to win a war? These questions wouldn't just haunt the 1970s. They'd shape America's role in the world for generations to come. Chapter 7. The Bigger Question. Was winning worth it? So what if America had won the Vietnam War? The answer isn't simple. Yes, victory would have boosted America's global standing and dealt a significant blow to communism. But the cost, in human lives, moral integrity, and economic stability, would be enormous. The real question isn't just whether America could have won. It's whether the victory would have been worth the price. Would a world shaped by an American triumph in Vietnam be any better? Or would it simply have different scars? Maybe the lesson isn't about winning or losing wars. Maybe it's about the cost of fighting them in the first place. Because if a victory leaves behind so much pain, regret, and unanswered questions, can we even call it a victory at all?